So I wonder if you and Jack after him could give us a sense right now of whether you're seeing the current difficulty in venture today as part of a cycle that we've seen in the past of ups and downs, a kind of correction to maybe a frothier time of pre-2008 downturn, or whether we're seeing some kind of fundamental, substantial, ongoing change that's going to dramatically change the nature of venture capital in the life sciences space. Dennis, why don't you begin?
Well, I think when you look at it, I mean, the people that own this industry are individuals, and they're through pension funds, retirement accounts, and things like that. And there's enormous pressure for states and local governments to return capital to their investors. So whereas before, the pension funds and the endowments and the like would have 7 or 8 year time horizons, their time horizons have shortened up a lot. And I think this is an important year for figuring this out. We're just intermediaries, Jack and I. We raise money from these people, whether it's Harvard University, State of California, whoever, and then hopefully invest it at a profit on their behalf. And there's about 20 plus funds that are trying to raise capital today. And I think over the next 12 months, we'll really see the tale about whether this is a short-term blip or we have a real long-term change. As I talk to people out there, people that still like venture capital tend to like technology more than life sciences, because their notion is you have the same number of losses in technology as you do in venture capital in life sciences. But on the technology side, you have that shot at a 20-to-1 or a 50-to-1. And a 50-to-1 in life sciences or a 20-to-1 in life sciences are few and far between. So even the people that are staying in venture capital tend to be putting their money more in the technology side. And people that have really supported the life sciences industry over time have definitely pulled back. One of our main investors is CalPERS, which is the California pension system, and they take 6% of their fund, which is about $150 billion, and they invested in alternative investments, real estate, timber, whatever, venture capital, LBOs. And of that 6%, 10% of it was going to venture capital. They've now announced that allocation is going from 10% to 1%. So there's a real fight to figure out where we can fund going forward. Some people are looking at sovereign wealth funds. Some people are looking at pharmaceutical or device companies. But the traditional guys, at least for the foreseeable future, I think are going to be on the sidelines. So, Jack, let me ask you to weigh in as well from your perspective. Dennis raised an issue that I was going to raise, which is what seems to be pretty widespread LP revolt from folks who are dissatisfied. There was a kind of famous or notorious Kaufman Foundation report earlier this year, which suggested that the returns from VCs to the LPs have been almost non-existent. And I was talking to one of Europe's top VCs who just raised a fund, raised smaller than they've ever raised before, and he said it's never been harder. Vertical Group has about as outstanding a track record as I can imagine medical devices. But for you going forward, do the averages belie the success that a good, smart VC can earn on behalf of its LPs, or are you finding your LPs dissatisfied? Are you finding a general downturn? And do you think it's permanent or cyclical?
Well, so, I should say, first of all, Vertical has a very weird structure. We really don't have very many LPs. It's mostly our own money, and it's an evergreen fund. But I can tell you as one of the major investors in Vertical, I'm pretty disappointed in my current returns. And, Dennis put his hand on it that what's happened is the liquidity preferences of investors, particularly LPs who really do fund most of the venture capital system, have declined. In other words, has increased. They want 7 year payouts at the most, while simultaneously the time to liquidity in our investments in medical and particularly in biotech have increased to 10, 11, 12, 13 years. I mean, it was bad before. It was very difficult before when we were sort of 7, 8, 9, and 10 years, but now it's gone in much worse. And simultaneously, you've had a couple of other things happen. The cost of developing technology in medicine, biotech, as well as devices has increased dramatically. We were just looking at the cost of clinical trials alone. The cost of clinical trials in biotech, in our last few biotech investments are now averaging $120,000 per patient. $120,000. That's up from just $40,000 just 5 years ago. That is an absurd and unsustainable increase. That's partially because of technology. It's partially because of FDA concerns. It's partially because we're using biomarkers. There's a whole bunch of things that are going into it, but those two trends together are not compatible. Desire for faster payouts by the institutions and much slower return for us. I'll give you some data, and then I don't want to talk about this anymore because it's just simply too depressing. But
we've only got 40 more minutes to go ahead.
We can move on. There's still very good deals being done on lots of great ideas, and in fact, there actually is a lot of money. There's plenty of money for really good ideas. But I was on the board of the NVCA until just a couple of months ago, and we take surveys of what our members are doing, and to put this in perspective, what everybody really needs to look at are not the dollars invested in medical devices or biotech, because that really masks what's going on. For example, recently the dollars have stayed very constant, but they're all shifting into later stage deals. So what you really want to look at are the early stage first round financings. So typically in medical devices, we were doing about 200 a year, all through 2000s, all through the 1980s. In the first quarter, so 200 a year, 150 to 200 a year. In the first quarter of this year, we did 10. 10. That's a 40 annual rate. This is as an industry. As an entire industry.
You're talking about just in medical devices?
In medical devices, around the same in biotech, a little bit higher in biotech. But again, it's about a 70 to 80% decline in the number of new companies that are being formed, And that may even reflect an even steeper decline in biotech, because biotech formation always outpaced device formation by a fairly large margin. Bob, let me come down to you. I want to talk about the M&A climate later, because obviously all of this would go away if only big companies would open their wallets and abundantly pay for these things. But we're talking here about a crisis that, if we don't begin to step up the technology development, technology funding, could have a ripple effect down the road. As you think about what the companies that you cover and what you're thinking about and looking at the future of the medical device industry, has it begun to worry you yet right now when you hear about where the venture folks are in terms of the kinds of return they're getting and the kinds of their willingness to invest in companies? Or is this simply a problem for one sector in this large ecosystem and doesn't really ripple to the kinds of companies that you're covering and kinds that you're doing? We should point out that in devices in particular, the IPO market has simply not been there for really pretty close to a decade. And if you look at a 20-year perspective, it's probably only been open 2 or 3 years within 20 years. Talk about what this kind of current crisis in the funding space, whether it's having any ripple effect in the realm in which you operate.
Yeah, it's thanks for the question. It's having a huge effect. 10 years ago, 8 years ago, the average stock in my universe traded at about a 30% premium to the S&P. Today, the average stock in my universe trades at about a 5% discount to the S&P. And that's due to a couple of reasons. One is that the industry just matured generally. But a big part of that is the investment community, even the real long-term thinkers, the guys that are graded on 3-5 year returns, look at these large companies and they don't see a pipeline. They don't see the innovation, and therefore they're not going to pay a premium multiple. So it is absolutely affecting the multiples of the large cap companies, and that impacts their willingness to do M&A.
But you would think it would be just the opposite. You would think it would stimulate their desire to do M&A. I wonder whether what big companies are seeing in the venture pipelines today are simply not really what they're looking for. I was on a program in Europe a couple of years ago, and it struck me because one of the people on the panel was the head of the Swiss Stock Exchange. And if you look at the Swiss Stock Exchange, it's a lot of dental companies and a lot of distributors and not anybody else. And if you look at the portfolios of the VC companies who are on the panel, it was like every other technology space. Are the VCs today and for the last decade, have they been investing in the kinds of companies that would make a meaningful difference to the big cap companies and to the mid cap companies?
Part of the problem is that the big cap and mid cap companies are kind of frozen. They don't know what's going on with the election. They don't know what's going on with Europe. They don't know what's going on in terms of how the environment in the U.S. is going to change over the next couple of years, because it has to, in terms of how devices are paid for and how much money is spent on technology. And I've almost seen sort of a schizophrenic approach to the new world, if you will, because there's no consensus on where we're going, and therefore the approach from the large companies is all over the place. I've got big cap companies that are getting smaller and splitting themselves in 2 and 3. I've got big cap companies like J&J that are getting bigger because they think that a single vendor approach is the right approach. I've got companies that are increasing spending on R&D because they think that innovation is the only way. I've got others that are decreasing R&D because they think that their investors now want buybacks and bigger dividends. So. In a certain way, if you wanted to put rose-colored glasses on this, there's so much uncertainty out there that if you had some conviction about where we really are going, then you can, probably make some money. But I agree with you that it is a little counterintuitive that there's not more M&A going on, but that's multifactorial. It's not just a function of the tougher financing world. It's just a function of the broader uncertainty out there. I've seen more M&A in the last 12 months from Japanese companies that I've never heard of buying U.S. medical device companies than I have of the standard buyers. And when the standard buyers are involved, they're buying private companies. They're buying they're taking smaller bites. Covidion's probably done 6 $200 to $300 million deals in the last year, and Boston's going to be doing that, and Bard is doing that, and that's probably that they're starting to take bites, but they're really small ones.
Dennis, you want to add?
Yeah, just following up on that a little bit. I mean, there's a bigger picture going on. When you don't have M&A, when you have Japanese companies that you never heard of buying U.S. companies, when you have no IPO windows, when you have 80% drop in startups and medical products, when you have more scientific publications originating outside of the U.S., I think the bigger question is what's going to happen to innovation in the U.S.
Yeah, that's a big worry to a lot of folks. And I don't know whether it's cause for anybody to step up and say, we're going to do it. This would be a nice lead into Milena, because that maybe angels are released here. But before that, Bob, I want you to I wanted to ask you one following question, because it seems to me that particularly in the device space, one of the key factors of uncertainty is the rapid turnover of CEOs we've seen in the last couple of years. If you take a snapshot of the top 10 medical device companies, I'm guessing now based on trying to formulate my guess is 6 of them have turned over in the last 2 or 3 years. We've seen these new senior executives at Medtronic, Covidien, Johnson & Johnson, Boston Scientific. Is that contributing to the uncertainty? And is this just an interesting snapshot in time, or is there a problem right now with the challenge? It would seem to me on the biopharma space, Dennis, maybe you have a perspective. These guys, may deserve to lose their jobs because the pipelines have been so dry. But in the device space, we're seeing incredible turnover CEOs. Does that contribute to the problem?
It does, and I think a lot of that is coincidental to the environment that we're in, and not necessarily a function of it. I mean, a lot of unique circumstances going on with the heads of a bunch of these companies, but it clearly limits their ability to do anything bold. Because I'll tell you what shareholders want. The shareholder base of a lot of these companies has really turned over, and it's now value investors. And what value investors want is, don't screw up too badly, return a lot of capital to shareholders, give me a good, consistent growth rate of just 2 to 4% and return a lot of capital to shareholders, and that's value creating. So that is really affecting the willingness. I had this conversation with the CFO of Boston Scientific just the other day of their kind of fear of doing something a little more aggressive, taking on dilution, and therefore losing and scaring away the shareholder base they have today. So just a lot of things coming at it at the same time. I would say from a positive perspective, because it's fairly easy to be negative, there are fewer dollars chasing interesting ideas. In my view, there are fewer investors looking at MedTech. So it used to be that a whiff of innovation was immediately discounted. And now that's not the case. It really has to be proven out. But to some degree, that's got to lead to some opportunities with fewer eyeballs on this space.
We'll pick up on that in just a second. But Milena, let me turn to you, because the question is right now is our angel invest in angel groups. So we've seen a ton of them spring up. LSAN is the most striking of the new ones. Is that a solution, or is that just another dead end, another alley, because there's not sustainable financing? If VCs are waiting longer to invest, what happens to the companies that take initial angel money and then need some more just 2 or 3 years down the road?
So everything what you just painted before, it sounds like angels have no right to exist, actually, because it doesn't make any sense for them. However, there is it's yes and no. Yes, in terms of, I mean, again, from what has been described right now, there are no really basically early stage. There's not much happening on the early stage. I.e., there's a lot of happening, but there's no funding available for the early stage companies. Everything has shifted absolutely. It is correct. Everything, a lot of venture capital money has shifted toward later stage opportunities, and that creates actually really great opportunities for those who have money and have tremendous deal flow at the early stage. Now, the question is where you get money. And that's the first question. Wherever you get money from, whether it's individual investors or those, as you said, investors from the outside of the United States who have seen past track record has been pretty good, and there was a time. It's the right time to invest right now. On the other side, there is also a way of adjusting to this new situation and trying to develop, fund, and basically not only fund, but just develop your startup in the most meaningful way. I was at the Kaufman Foundation Life Sciences Summit 2 weeks ago, and there was a panel led by Paul Yock, with 3 or 4 CEOs.
Program.
Yeah, Stanford by Design. There were 3 or 4 CEOs, and all of them were CEOs of early stage companies. Basically, each company represented its own regulatory path, from class 1 to 510K de novo, and the PMA. And most of them, except for the class 1, actually went outside the United States, especially the PMA company. They already have their revenues in Europe. They're selling their device, and when the question was asked, so what are you actually, when are you planning to come to US? I said, well, we'll figure it out. So this is one of the ways for the company to see their future. So, as far as, going back to your original question, whether there is a play for angels or not, angels has been always out there. There's nothing new about that. I would say there is a burst of angel activities, as well as probably the new paradigms, which I do not necessarily support. I don't think
we're certainly seeing more sophisticated angels.
Right.
This is not just your next door neighbor's an orthopedic surgeon and he likes your idea and he's going to put some money in. LSAN is an example of that.
LSAN is a different model. I would say it's almost like a VC where because we do have process, actually vetting process, and the difference is that we fund companies out of, by the means of personal, wealthy individuals versus having a fund at this point. So it's, and again, but angels also have limitations. It's going to be very difficult for an angel to fund a company that's going to be PMA. There is no angel that's looking at the PMA company. That company is going to require PMA approval, or it's very difficult, or I would say it's challenging to get PMA excited about biotechnology company. It just doesn't. I would say it's almost non-existing situation. There is certain cut that you have to, or certain criteria that you have to apply to companies that come to be funded to angels. And again, they're angels and technology. They've been around for a long time. It's definitely a different path, even though it's still, good company and technology also takes a lot of money. People don't realize that angel investors in Google have seen their money first and after 6 years of development in the company. So it's not like Google gave them money in 18 months. So, but again, it's being an angel investor in healthcare, especially in medical devices and services.
So you're teeing up an area I want to talk. So, in an effort to kind of redirect this to something a little bit more upbeat, not that this hasn't been enlightening so far. But, life science has always been, we talked about a lot of the environmental factors, things that are going on are kind of creating a backlash against venture investing. But the life science sector, generally speaking, I would say has been one where there has always been the promise of technology that has driven a lot of value, both technological and commercial. I wonder if any of you see a space or a couple spaces today that you would actually bet on going forward that might hold the promise going forward. And just tipping my hand a little bit, shameless plug, our next issue will feature an article on Cleveland Clinic and their innovations program. And you know where their single biggest flow of ideas are coming from? Health IT. That's where the Cleveland Clinic physicians are generating ideas. But I wonder if each of you could try to pinpoint where you think there is some area of promise, some area of opportunity. Dennis, you look like you're really ready with a good answer. So
I don't know about specifics, but I know some facts. 15,000 people in the country turn 65 years old every day. 100 million people in this country have chronic diseases of which we have no cures. We have between 80 and 100 cancers with only a handful that can be effectively treated. We consume about 50% of the world's drugs and devices, and we only have 5% of the population. This is a humongous problem, and we have started to tackle it. If you look at cystic fibrosis, you look at hepatitis C, you look at prostate cancer now with the latest approval. We have had some real successes, but going forward, we're all getting older, and we're all getting sicker, so the unmet need remains.
Is there any places that you're looking at specifically and saying, I wouldn't have invested there 5 years ago, but now I really want to jump. I want to jump on that.
We're doing more. We think that the consumer is going to play a greater and greater role, and the consumer venture capitalists really don't understand what the life sciences venture capitalists do. The life sciences venture capitalists don't understand the consumer side. So we think the intersection of medicine and consumers, as consumers take more control of their health, is an area that might be interesting, and we've made a couple of bets there.
Jack, I just want to point to you because many, many years ago, you made an investment in Kaifon when no one else would make an investment in that space. You saw something there that you didn't, which suggests a kind of contrarian approach or contrarian view. As you look at the current environment today, do you have the same kind of confidence in that contrarian view? Are you seeing things that no one else is seeing, or is it time for you to kind of sit by and wait for some things to go by, some time to develop for the market to kind of rationalize or come out? What are you looking at these days?
Yeah, so I don't think our approach has changed at all. I think our hurdle has gotten a little bit higher, so the screen has gone a little bit tougher. But we always look at in the white space, obviously, unmet needs, problems that haven't been solved, as Dennis just said. I mean, there are just an unbelievable number of problems yet to be solved. And I might have a slightly contrarian view because, I've listened to some of the things that have been said here before, and some of the sort of the common wisdoms I really hasn't applied. I mean, we don't invest in management teams, for example. That has never been our main criteria. Our criteria has always been, have you identified a really good unmet need? And most importantly, is your thing an anti-gravity machine or not? i.e., does it work? And in fact, all of our failures have been it didn't work. We've never made a mistake on a market. We can always fix management teams. I hate to say that, but it's really true. You can fix management. But if somebody, if somebody wants to do non-invasive glucose, that's a really, really, really hard problem. And, lots of people have tried and failed. So we're investing today. When I look at our portfolio, we have we like the neuro space. We think a stroke is just an absolutely gigantic unmet need, as well as other chronic neuro problems like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's. So there are lots of opportunities there. Obviously, obesity, diabetes are still gigantic problems. And again, I point out in obesity, everybody knows obesity is a gigantic problem. And historically, the problem hasn't been identifying the problem. It's finding something that works. Basically the only surgical procedure that really works is the Roux-en-Y, and all the minimally invasive procedures, including balloons and, tubes and everything else so far have not worked on a risk-benefit adjusted basis. So we look at all of these things. We're still very active. We're still making new investments. But our criteria tends to, again, be large unmet needs. Now, I will say one thing has changed, which is we are much more skeptical about FDA timelines, and we discount those. So historically, we thought we had a pretty good feel for how long something would take to get through the FDA, and sort of whatever our judgment is today, we just double it. We just assume that it's going to take twice as long, and when you add twice as long and twice as much money to get through it, a lot of ideas we would have financed fall by the wayside.
You would actually, you might pass on what you think is a promising technology because you think the external hurdles are too high. Yeah. You just don't factor into the deal.
Correct.
Dennis? Do you worry about reimbursement?
So it's funny because I've spent the last 5 years working with the FDA on behalf of NVCA to try to fix FDA, and I think we've made some progress, a little bit of progress, and of course now all I think about is Louis Jacques and Medicare. So yes, I'm extremely worried about reimbursement.
You think about these innovations. When the human genome was completed, we spent something like $3.5 billion to get the first genome completed. Today we're at $1,000 within a decade. It's like unbelievable. And if you look at the last 3 days in the New York Times, I mean that's the future of cancer treatment. I mean we may be a little bit early there, but that's where we're going to be in a not too distant future. So there's remarkable advances being made.
Well, Milena, going back to the Cleveland Clinic, I know you're very, very passionate about health IT. Talk to us about the opportunities in health IT in this space. Is it a great new frontier, or is it we've been there, done that, and there's just a lot of noise right now?
A lot of noise significantly contributes to that, but there's actually a real need, and it's health IT is a very broad category. Health IT, speaking about health IT, like we invest in healthcare IT is going to sound like we invest in medicine. Healthcare IT has a lot of verticals, and they're healthcare services. They are there's mobile health, there's telemedicine, there's consumer aspect to it, which is also again very attractive, but very difficult to judge to gauge because you simply as someone who's spent most of your lives in the hardcore medical device area, it's very hard to understand how one is going to execute on the consumer side, right? Because it's a completely different story. However, I would say the opportunities in healthcare IT are real. This year has been really big for healthcare IT, and you see a lot of it's a shopping spree going from people grabbing things here and there. There's a lot of also consolidation happening in the healthcare services on the healthcare services side. Where the opportunities are, and I would say mobility is definitely is going to play a role because mobile health. But again, we're not talking about $3.99 apps because it's not a sustainable business. I mean, for that you might want to go to crowdfund your project because it's going to require very little. But speaking of business opportunities, it's mobile health, telemedicine. And I would say, the interesting thing about healthcare IT, and again, speaking of mobile applications or maybe telemedicine, is the fact that you can actually launch that again across geographies. It doesn't have to be U.S. specific. The good thing about it also that it's most of those devices or concepts applicable to U.S. it could work elsewhere. Most of them would not require. Do not require as vigorous FDA, and I mean FDA doesn't put their arms around it yet. But there's a clear distinction between data transmission and clinical decision making. If the data, if whatever data that's being obtained during at your with a mobile device is helping you to make a decision, make clinical decision, then this is going to be treated as a device, class 2 device. It's going to be regulated exactly the way everything else is. But there are ways to go around it. Don't film it. So there were ways to go around it and specific applications to that. So that's basically about healthcare IT.
I was going to ask this later, but and I don't mean to bias the answer by the way I'm phrasing the question. Is anybody taking crowdsourcing seriously as a way of funding a life science company?
No.
Not at $120,000 a patient. You can't.
Also, crowdfunding is something that angels are crowdfunding, right? I call it tough crowdfunding. It's when you run a marathon, right? I mean, you get these things have been known for ages, right? You call your friends, you make a list. It's a Juvenile Diabetes Foundation, it's a Leukemia Society, it's friends and family, and those who support you. Whatever you're going to take money from if someone naively think that $25 donation is going to make great technologies go. I mean, I would just not
but there's a growing number of diabetic patients in this world, and
right.
They're very concerned. Wouldn't they be exactly the kind of crowdfunding source? I'm interested in great technology. I don't want to return. I just want to make certain somebody's developing great stuff, and right now, no one else is investing it. So all the diabetics are all going to get together and fund this great technology from this really smart guy out of University.
That's philanthropy. This is not investment. I mean, and you should never, I would never confuse those two things, because there is charity, which has to exist and has to support those projects. And actually that charity allows those companies to grow, allows that, maybe you can secure IP, maybe you can do something, but then there is an investment. I mean, and that have nothing to do with.
Dennis, Jack, I know you want to weigh in on this.
There's a company up in Boston called Vertex. And for years and years, they spent $200 million a year trying to tackle hepatitis C.
Right.
And they had a compound on the shelf that had some impact on cystic fibrosis, but they were so focused on hepatitis C that it just sat there. The Cystic Fibrosis Foundation came and gave them $30 million to get started. And out of that collaboration between the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation and Vertex, we now have had the biggest breakthrough in CF patients than we've ever had. It's a great example of marrying philanthropy with for-profit.
And I know a lot of the pharma companies are turning increasingly to patient or disease-driven organizations too, because they are so interested in basic research and advancing therapies.
The venture guys are doing it too. I mean, why should we look at one CF company on an off basis when you can go to the foundation and get to know the thought leaders, get to know what's in the pipelines and things like that. So I think we're going to see more cooperation there.
Jack?
So I was going to make 2 points. One on the crowdfunding. So one of my mentors, when I first started in 1980, gave me some very good advice. He was an oil and gas guy who was based in New York. He said to me, by the time I never invest in deals that get to New York in the oil and gas business. He said, by the time they get to New York, that means all the smart guys in Texas have said no. So I sort of feel that way about crowdfunding, right? That is, if you're really left with crowdfunding,
no one ever else has said no.
Unless it's small. I'm obviously, there are things that are too small for the venture community. That's a market inefficiency. But other than that, I mean, there's still a lot of money in the venture capital community. And the other point, and this is really following kind of along the lines that Dennis just mentioned, if a situation is unsustainable, it won't, right? It won't continue that way. And paying $120,000 for a clinical trial in the United States is simply unsustainable, and it's just undoable. And I think part of our job, and we're all beginning to do it, is to figure out ways not to do that. So we're figuring out ways to do this in China, all sorts of different models. Obviously, the whole biomarker thing in biotech is just as a reaction to that. We have to get a much better screening of patients and improve the signal-to-noise ratio in our trials. So we're going through, I think, a little of this right now is a bit of a transition. Things are changing. We're adapting to it. On the device side, I'm not sure that's true. I think the screen for devices has really increased. I was at a function with this guy, Richard Gilfillan, who you will be hearing more about, who is the head of the Innovation Center at Medicare. He used to run the Geisinger Clinic. And he made a speech, and in the speech he basically said to an assembled group of venture capitalists in MedTech Biotech, he said, listen, if you come to me with something that works a lot better and costs the same, I'll pay for it. If you come to me with something that is a lot cheaper, just solves a problem, is a lot cheaper, I'll pay for that. Do not come to me with innovations that are really better but also cost more. I just won't pay for it. And
so you raise an interesting point, because I was going to say that what you hear more and more is that what's driving opportunity isn't so much technology, it's cost savings, system cost savings. And so the question is, does every new innovation today have to, in some level, address the whole issue of saving costs? One of the new CEOs, Omar Ishkar from Medtronic, came from General Electric, where they pioneered the concept of reverse innovation. It seems to be, we're talking about a very different, in the device world at least, a very different a model for innovation, one that really is willing to compromise to a degree on clinical outcomes in favor of reduce overall costs. I know even in the biopharma space, people are talking about an end to the limit of if you build it, they will come technology development. Dennis?
Yeah, I mean, when I started this, if you got the proof of concept, you won. You could take it to the bank, and then it became proof of relevance or you're relevant. And today it's proof of reimbursement. And if you don't have cost effectiveness, and pretty soon where we're headed, at least on the drug side, is payers aren't going to pay for it unless it works.
Right.
So you go back to the biomarker thing. We're not going to pay for drugs where they don't work on 60% of the people. So the whole biomarker space becomes incredibly important.
It's the same issue coming up in oncology now, where people simply reach the finite limit for a 4-month extension of life.
The problem with that is that the 4-month extension of life today, may lead to some insights that give you a year extension tomorrow, and maybe it gives you 5 years down the road. So the argument, we have to debunk the idea, I think, a little bit that we're spending all this money and adding 1 month of life, because that might just be the start.
Right. Well, you add a month, and eventually you're talking about real money, right? I mean,
So I want to open it up for questions just a minute, but let me, before I do that, come back to Bob, and I want to talk about an area that we skirted around before, and that's the current M&A climate. We started this program with Howard and Mark, and I think by all measures, Ardian is one of the great success stories in the medical device space in the last couple of years. So let me ask you this. Will Medtronic ever make back its investment in Ardian?
Well, before I answer that, I have a plea, and that is that my favorite medical device statistic is that over the last 10 years, the average growth rate of a large cap medical device company has shrunk about 80%. The average growth rate is now about 2%. And yet the percentage of money that they're spending on sales and marketing is higher than it was 10 years ago. So the medical device sales and marketing model has not changed despite a complete change in the growth outlook for these companies. And the kind of innovation that I think would be wonderful would be innovation in a delivery network. The companies all talk about maybe someday thinking about it, but they never will because it's too much risk. I mean, who's going to go first in cutting commission rates to your orthopedic sales rep or what have you? I just think somewhere out there in venture land, there's got to be a good idea from a delivery perspective, and maybe it starts with the slightly lower tech areas. Where like everybody, for example, knows that kind of one aneurysm coil is the same as the next. To give you one example, why can't there be a really good generic medical device market for certain parts of it to start us down the path of lowering SG&A expense from 40% of sales down to 20%. It's one thing that just sticks out in my models as a huge opportunity for innovation.
And let me rephrase the question I put to you. I still want to find out whether you think Medtronic's going to ever make any money off its Ardian billion-dollar Ardian investment. But when I think about the really great success stories in medical device over the course of the last couple of years, Ardian, Acclarent, St. Francis, Connor Med Systems, whatever the success failure, they were purely clinical stories. This was not about system cost savings, not about finding cheaper. It was about delivering a great new technology that was going to change the practice of medicine. Is that a sustainable model going forward for the way medical device companies should be thinking about the kinds of technology they should be acquiring?
In my view, I think that's very difficult for the large companies to do at this point because there's so much at risk right now, and these companies they've all consolidated. The average revenue base of the large cap companies now is probably pushing $10 billion. So very hard to move that needle, and yet you're in an environment where it's very difficult to take risks. So I think that this leads into the Ardian question. Ardian in that whole market is just so unique. In medical devices, that I bet I'll count on one hand over the next 10 years the kind of markets with that type of potential. Who knows? It might totally flop. But if you're ever going to be stupid about spending too much money to get something, that would be the time. And my favorite Ardian story is that the cover bid on that was Merck. Merck is the leading cardiovascular company in the world. They did a lot of due diligence, and they almost paid $1 billion for a startup medical device company. That would have been a heck of a headline.
And they weren't the only pharma company in the bidding.
So I think that it was, that it is yet to play out. J&J looked awful silly for a while in drug-coated stents until Boston wrote them a $1.7 billion check for IP 10 years later. Boston really hasn't made much money on drug-coated stents when you factor in all the IP losses. But so I think that the verdict is out. I think that Medtronic, this was actually one where it might be real dividends to be first.
So, Jack, you're in the device space. Dennis, I will also open it to you, and Melanie, you can weigh in as well. Martin Rothman is now famously saying that there's 62 renal denervation companies. J&J guys put it closer to 40. Is that because this is a great space to be in, as evidenced by the Medtronic acquisition? We've seen Covidien do some follow-on acquisition investments. Or when you see those numbers of companies rushing in to space to capitalize on renal denervation as a clinical opportunity, do you want to run in the opposite direction because you've missed that boat? Jack, if I brought you a really interesting technology in renal denervation, the fact that there are, if not 60, maybe 20 or 30 companies, does that at all weigh into your factor whether you invest that company?
I think that's one of the best contraindicators you can possibly have in the device sector. I mean, when we sold Cymed in 1994 or something to Boston Scientific for $1 billion, and there were 40 or 50 cardiovascular companies after that. Now, a couple of them got sold for something. I mean, there were 60 kyphoplasty companies after the Kyphon transaction, and I think they're all bankrupt. I mean, it's just, you just can't do it. You've got to be, I mean, if there are companies that were formed around the same time as Artie, that are just right behind Artie, and those are probably fabulous investments. But the next 50 are going to be disastrous investments.
Dennis, you're shaking your head.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I'm just not smart enough to figure that one out. So I think it's a contraindicator too.
The United States has been the source of all innovation in medicine and biotech for the last 50 years, basically. And the reason is that we have a reimbursement system that has been willing to pay a premium for innovation. Mm-hmm. And frankly, they've been willing to pay far more than the innovation is worth on the day they actually pay for it. But eventually, as Dennis points out, you add a month, and all of a sudden you have 5 years of survival advantages in cancer. The problem is that no other country in the world has shown any evidence of being able to do this or any willingness to do this.
Has ridden the coattails of that.
And it's been a free riding system. I mean, everybody understands it's a free rider. The problem is, if you're the only horse left, there's nothing else to ride, right? If we stop doing this, it stops for the whole world. I don't believe Singapore is going to replace us, basically.
The one big market opportunity we haven't spoken about yet is the emerging market, the growth, what people are now calling the growth market opportunities. We've talked about Medtronic. Omar Shkar is a huge partisan, a huge advocate of that. So is Joe Almeida from Covidien. We know that the pharma companies are laying off people in the U.S. and building up staff in the growth markets. Is that because that's where this industry is going, speaking to the concerns that were raised, that innovation is moving outside the U.S. and moving into other places, or is that a false hope? I talked to one Chinese investor, and I said, what are you guys doing in the whole area of biotech? And she said to me, well, you got to understand, we can make a fortune making shopping carts. What are we going to do a biotech deal for it? Melanie, you...
Yeah, I mean, as someone hasn't had an exposure to... For last 6 months or so to all U.S. markets as well, I would say it's innovation. I mean, there's a lot of strive for innovation. They want to do that, but they all want to copy U.S. market. They all want to learn from the U.S. experience. They all want to learn how things are happening here. And I would say all U.S. markets are mostly for to leverage it, to leverage certain things, to do to outsource R&D, to do first in man. To do those things that will allow, again, a company that has been basically conceived in the U.S. de-risk it to a certain point and then bring it back to the U.S. Or maybe not bring it back to the U.S., but continue to it, because by far U.S. is still is the biggest economy, and we have still the best system, arguably healthcare system in the world. So I want
to get the VC perspective. Bob, let me bring you into this conversation right now, only because you were talking about the need on the part of big companies to kind of make their case to institutional investors. A lot of them today are making it in terms of their ability to tap into the emerging markets. As you think about and look at, it seems to me that we're getting mixed signals. Some, like Medtronic and Covidien, are placing a big bet, but I know Mike Musalem from Edwards is very skeptical about emerging markets and moving into China. Where do you see the emerging markets, China, India, Singapore, Brazil, Russia, in terms of creating growth opportunities, creating value for the big cap device companies?
I guarantee you every single one of those CEOs would swap positions with Musalem if they had his market in front of them. This is it's a function of their own reality. I'm very cynical about emerging markets. I've got Bard that has almost no exposure there, talking about it, and Boston Scientific has almost no exposure there, talking about it as the panacea, just like I've got Medtronic and Covidien talking about it because they're so advanced. Like, if you're not there, it's a great opportunity. If you are there, it's a great opportunity because you're big. So, we have yet to really know how it's going to play out in terms of what devices truly end up being successful there. Right now, most of the companies are growing their emerging businesses off of a very low base. It's about 9% of revenues for most of my companies, and it's growing anywhere from 15 to 25% for most of these companies. So, but I really don't, at this point, know how to think about it from a medical device perspective. Drugs is a little bit more straightforward, I think. But I think it still really has yet to play out.
You think it's more straightforward because the patient populations are larger? I mean, why would it be?
Well, just because it seems like it's more government regulated and the rules are a little bit better defined. I think it's sort of silly to talk about ICDs in emerging markets, for example, given the technology and support that's needed. And so we just need to better define it. Right now, I'm very cynical because I've got every company telling me it's the most exciting thing they have going on. And the reason they're saying is because they have so little else that's going on that's good. So we have to, kind of take that with a huge grain of salt at this point, and we'll have plenty of time to figure it out. Right now, Stryker's the only one that's really honest. They're like behind closed doors, like, it really doesn't matter right now.
Although I have heard some guys, even with Omar there, I've heard some guys from Medtronic say, we think it's big, we haven't figured it out yet.
You've got to be dedicating tremendous resources, and when I model, I consider it almost a separate product category.
You do.
So not to diminish.
So when Medtronic says that X% of our growth the next couple of years is going to come from emerging markets, do you discount that as a statement of where the direction of the company's going in?
Enormously. I don't think any of us know yet because it's not as easy in the U.S. That's one market. You're talking about 12 that are evolving themselves in terms of how they pay for it and how they regulate it. So. But I think it's a huge opportunity, but in terms of picking relative winners and losers, rather than handing you a spreadsheet telling you who's got the most exposure, it's very difficult for me to make a call right now on who's a true winner. I tend to think it's going to be some of the companies that thread the needle with high enough technology such that it's difficult to copy, but low enough technology that it's easy to deliver. But it's hard for me right now to identify those at this point.
Jack, Dennis, do you on the venture side see any opportunities coming? Would you take a chance on an opportunity, or is managing an investment in China or Singapore simply too taxing to do?
We're in the middle of one right now, and the board meetings start at 10 in the morning, which means they start at 10 o'clock at night over here. It's a pretty big pain unless you have feet on the ground. But right before I came over here, some company came in to see us with a lupus drug. Kind of interesting mechanism of action, 30-patient trial. The trial looked pretty interesting. The trial was done in China with Chinese investigators. I don't know what we're going to do with that. We don't know the people. Yeah. If it's in the U.S., I can make the phone call and say, hey, this guy's this guy's a crook or whatever. I don't know what to make of it. And yet the trial looks pretty darn good, and it's a pretty big unmet need. We don't know what to do.
Also, it was an interesting point that again was made at the Kaufman Summit. Paul York again brought up the same thing. He says, well, when you're picking, for example, when you're trying to do your OUS trials, right, or anything, make sure that the person who's your PI actually is publishable and can present, because in any other cases, you just basically it's a waste of time or money or anything. So
yeah, their biodesign does have satellite programs in India and China and Singapore.
Right. But again, speaking of foreign markets, it's also or emerging markets. It's also all of that I mean, it's not just one country. Each country has its own regulation, its own payer system, and its own cultural, I would say, specifics, which you cannot neglect. And it's very naive to go to China without having someone who's, understanding someone really well, Chinese market and dynamics. I mean, I wouldn't invest in Russia unless you really know what yes that means, or what they mean actually, but they're saying you something. So it's you need to really know. It's not only just about technology.
What about as a source of capital, though? And Jack, you're an evergreen fund, but Dennis, as you think about LPs saying no and cutting back from 10 to 3%, supposedly there's tons of money flowing through those emerging markets and people looking for a place to put that money. Would you entertain tour through the Far East to line up some LPs?
How long
have you done it already?
How long does it take to get to Kennedy?
But just to answer your other question, I'll tell you a story because it's very interesting. It's a real lesson. So we made the mistake of turning down a company called Lepu, and our partners Warburg Pincus did it. This was a coated stent company, cardiac stent company in China, and we turned it down because you've got to be kidding, right? I mean, this is a commodity. There are 30 large companies that have much, much better cardiac stents than Lepu did. And, we turned it down for fundamental reasons, which is how can you possibly compete against, Abbott, et cetera. And we forgot to look at the really critical piece of data, which is whose kid was on the board. Mm-hmm. And the son of one of the Politburo members was on the board, and Warburg made 30x their money in 1 year. So the problem is that you can't the problem in these countries is that the investment analysis is very, very, very different. It's not the way we do it in the United States.
Let me just ask one final question. Let's assume that we're all still doing this 5 years from now, and it's 2017. In 2017, as we all look back at the period of, say, 2012 or 2011 and to 2016, do you think we'll look back at this as a time of great opportunity and great technology, or do you think we'll look back at it as a time of uncertainty and under-realized potential? Where exactly are we right now?
Do you want me to start? I'll be positive.
Anybody can jump in.
No, I think it's a time of opportunity, actually. The times like that create a lot of opportunities, and you should be just analyze it, give it a thought, and just go for it.
Dennis, Jack?
There are fabulous opportunities out there. I mean, Dennis pointed to oncology, where I think we are going to cure cancer in the next 30 years. We're going to cure it in a completely different way than we thought, but we're going to do it. And, in the way I look at the world is, ask me how my 18 phase 3 trials turned out over that 5-year period. I'll tell you whether it was a good 5 years or not. So.
Great. Dennis, you want a final word here?
No, we just got to make it through here. If we can make it through to 16 or 17, this is going to have been a great time. Some of us aren't going to make it through, and that's life, but maybe it's good for the industry. But I'm where Melina and Jack are.
Great. Let's thank our panelists. It's been a fascinating discussion. If you all will hold